So not only do I have to go after this whole panel, but I also have to knit it all together. Thank you, though, for the opportunity. In this conference, there's rightly been a lot of attention to policy. But we really need to remember that policies and programs don't go in on a blank slate. People themselves have always been responding to shocks, and Haile Gebrselassie has given us a very inspiring testament to that. Lindiwe mentioned growing up in a village. I actually also grew up in a village in India, and some of my earliest memories are of my mom administering food for work programs. But it was the women themselves who were doing the work. And I think that's important for us to remember. So I've also been very pleased to hear how many presenters from the Prime Minister on have been acknowledging the importance of community action for building resilience. Just as good physical capital or infrastructure is important to deliver emergency supplies, so also social capital is important for delivering collective action. Two important sources of that social capital are groups, formal and informal, and social networks. These build trust, coordination, shared norms, and cooperation. In my talk today, I'm going to try and address how policymakers, donors, practitioners, face it, us outsiders, can factor in social capital more meaningfully, and then especially apply this to marginalized people. I hope I won't sound too much like a researcher or an idealist to suggest that a big part of the answer is to understand what people are already doing or not doing, so that we enhance rather than crowding out that work. And actually, I was very grateful that Bekele Galeta suggested that there is a role for researchers. Earthring Cousin talked about resilience as the current that connects preparedness, response, recovery, and development. Let me build on that image to suggest that social capital provides one of the key conduits for that current. For example, in the Nyando Basin, Western Kenya, people work together to clear the channels to reduce flooding. So let's just keep that image up here as we talk about social capital a bit. In terms of both preparedness and development, careful stewarding of the commons, resources shared such as rangelands, forests, water, seed banks, biodiversity, are keys to resilience. Communities have been managing such resources for sometimes thousands of years. Marginalized people are especially dependent on such commons. Peter Little has already mentioned some about how transhuman pastoralists use their networks and alliances, and some of the strategies that they use. Irrigation is another way of preparing for drought, and most effective irrigation systems depend on people working together at some level to share the water and maintain the systems. Beyond the rural areas, migrant networks help with occupational diversification while keeping ties back home that help when the jobs outside dry up, and they do. For response and recovery at the local level, death of a family member is one of the biggest shocks that can really set people back and drive them into poverty. Around the world, and at least back to the Roman Empire, people have formed funeral societies to help each other out with the expenses and stresses that happen in the time of a death of a family member. Ethiopia's Idir are an excellent example of this. John Hodnott and Stefan Durkan have studied how some of these Idir have even expanded into providing health insurance to their members to provide even broader sources of resilience. Even with larger shocks, Daniel Aldrich found that neighborhoods and communities with deeper reserves of social capital can effectively mobilize, coordinate, and overcome collective action problems to better survive during and recover after shocks. Using qualitative and quantitative data from a variety of disasters, 1923 Tokyo earthquake to the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and Hurricane Katrina in the US, this pattern is found across space and time. Anita Kendrick mentioned that a lesson from the recovery of the tsunami in Aceh was that communities can take the lead in their own recovery. For example, delivering housing cheaper with higher quality, planning and building infrastructure. Part of this was that their role in maintaining, in monitoring, and creating transparency on the use of resources. Outside interventions that ignore the social institutions and arrangements that support collective action are likely to displace them and can even create dependencies that reduce resilience. Other problem, though, is to idealize social capital and assume that it will be there and that serve communities equitably. John McDermott said what is important is empowering local responses to shocks and human capacity at the individual and collective levels, but also expect that the stressors will go beyond the existing capacity, so there will be a need for additional measures. This is where I come back to my point about the need to understand what's going on. A limitation of social capital is that many of the customary institutions are being eroded or damaged by migration or serious shocks. At least knowing what has been there can provide a start, and many NGOs and even government programs have experience with how to work with communities to strengthen collective action. Returning to marginalized populations, we often find that as a group, Indigenous people, pastoralists, and others have strong social capital, but we shouldn't idealize. For example, many of these groups are public space and hence male space. Women may not be included or feel comfortable speaking in public. Identifying the kinds of groups where women are active can be a part there, and Groots has lots of experience in that, for example. The very poor are often excluded also, and we have examples of this from Bangladesh and how BRAC works with targeting the ultra-poor program to build capacity as well as social capital. In many cases, social capital-based institutions give way to more formal ones. Uma Swaminathan can tell us about how Sewa is moving from self-help groups to cooperatives to companies owned by poor women in India. But collective action should not be left behind in the quest for development. After a super tornado hit Arkansas State in the US recently, the key message picked up from the governor's press conference was, and I quote, Arkansans are resilient and they work together. Neighbors help neighbors and communities help communities. Why did he say that when he's calling in the National Guard? I think an important message of that was to recognize the dignity of the people most affected, that no matter how devastating the shock was and how much they have lost in material and lives, they are still the primary agents of rebuilding. And that's an important lesson in resilience programming. Thank you for joining in this effort.